If she has so far failed to do anything to improve living standards over the next 5 years, what can she realistically now do, or what should she have done in this budget? She's constantly saying, I'm investing for the long term, give me praise for that, because chancellors never do that. Well, fine, right? But if you can barely pay your bills, it's a bit of a crisis at the moment. Yeah. What else should she do? Today we're joined by somebody who's been on this podcast before, Andy Haldane, former Chief Economist of the Bank of England, currently runs the Royal Society of Arts, but still takes what you might call a deep, possibly an even unhealthy interest in the economic fortunes of this country. I mean, I suppose I might just kick off by asking you, Andy, in the sort of budgets that we've taken, or among the budgets that we've all taken an interest in over the past, I mean, in my case, decades.
100 years.
Yeah, something like that. How important was this budget compared to, I don't know, the 92 budget, the 97 budget, the 2010 budget?
Up there, I would think. Early days, day two, but I think we know enough already to think that this will register in the history books. I mean, partly in purely financial terms. An extra £70 billion, over 2% of GDP, would mark it out as being of financial significance.
That's in spending terms.
In pure spending terms, extra spending terms. But I think or perhaps even more importantly than that, Steph and Robert, it does mark a pretty sharp shift philosophically in how we approach the management of our economy, particularly when it comes to putting the public balance sheet to work in reinvesting in our public services and beyond in a way that's not been true for the better part of probably 3 decades, I would say. So yes, a big financial mouthful, but more significantly, a big philosophical handbrake turn from where we've been.
The last time you were talking to Robert, when I wasn't here, you talked about how we are riddled with risk aversion. And you said that actually, in terms of taking risks again, it's got to be the government that lead the way on that. Yeah. Do you think this is risky enough?
Yeah. Well, at the moment, the Chancellor's been criticised for bearing too much risk in what has happened, at least in some quarters. But my starting point would be, just as you say, Steph, which is this enough being borne by the public balance sheet to really get growth going?
So we've had underinvestment in this country, frankly, all our lives, right? And whether it's public sector investment or private sector investment, less money has been going into the stuff that generates long-term growth and productivity than, is invested in all of our competitor economies.
Yeah.
It's one of the reasons growth and living standards have been so disappointingly lackluster in the UK. Is this enough of a step change when it comes to public sector investment?
Not yet, but that's why, this is a very good down payment. The extra roughly 25, 30 billion in public investment each year is a good starting point, because without that, we'd have seen public investment relative to national income falling. And you cannot grow an economy in which public investment is falling from an already far too low base. So now the profile is of flatlining in public investment relative to national income. That's better than it was. Is it good enough, though, to make good on those 30, 40 years of underinvestment? Not yet. Not yet.
My worry as well is where the private investment's going to come from. If, from this budget, we've seen it's businesses that are taking the brunt of it in terms of employer wages and, rate reliefs and all manner of tax changes for them will mean inevitably they will have less money to invest. Growth's not looking great in that time. So what are we going to get the private investment we need as well? Because that is a huge part of this, isn't it?
That's the big swing factor, for me, which is having put some money on the table from the public balance sheet, does that serve to crowd in more private investment, or does it instead crowd it out because taxes are rising, because bond yields might be nudging up a little bit as well, borrowing costs might be nudging up a little bit as well? And the truth is we can't know for sure. Will this be a spur for the animal spirits of the private sector, or will it be a blocker to those animal spirits? My guess would be, if not immediately, then in the fullness of time, that one of the things that's getting in the way of private businesses investing right now is because they can't get their hands on the skills.
Yeah.
Or the staff are too sick, or our transport systems are too poor, or people can't find the houses, or the energy's too expensive or insecure. So investing in those things, as happened yesterday in the budget, is a prerequisite of getting private investment going. And therefore, overall, we'll see crowding in of private investment rather than the crowding out that was too much of the discourse. I thought too much of the discourse around the budget yesterday.
I mean, there's an enormous amount, actually, to sort of unpicking what you've just said. I want to start with one aspect of it. If you look at why a country like France has significantly higher levels of productivity and significantly higher living standards, some of that is to do with how over decades they've invested in way better transport links than we have, way better, super fast railways, the TGV. Their motorways are significantly better than ours. It's a much better connected country than the UK. One of the things that I was slightly disappointed in is actually the capital budget for transport has been cut a bit. Now, you say it's important to invest in green energy. Very few people from a climate change point of view would disagree with that. But broadly, when you're in, and there is a lot more money, actually. I mean, one of the areas that benefited, and it sort of tells you something about the confidence of individual members of the cabinet. Ed Miliband plainly has the confidence of the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, and he's got a lot more money to invest. Louise Haigh, for reasons that are not completely clear, has got rather less money to invest in transport. Now, I would argue that the marginal returns when it comes to growth and productivity from investing in transport rather are greater, frankly, than the marginal returns they'll get from investing in energy. It's not to say I don't want to do the energy investment, but if you're looking for growth, you would choose transport right now over energy. Am I wrong about that?
I don't know about if you were comparing like for like. The social return on those investments are both large right now.
Yeah.
Which one is high? I think that's hard to say.
All right.
What I would say, I mean, you're right. Personalities matter. Personnel matters. And the fact that Ed's an experienced minister has helped, as does the fact that his policy was oven ready. He had a green prosperity plan several years ago, and therefore that was good to go from the get-go. That's not been true across the vast majority of other policy portfolios. And of course, we're dealing with ministers who are newly minted in role. We will have several further bites of this cherry, of course, not least in the spending review that will take place next spring. And it'll be fixing the spending envelope over the remainder of the term of this Parliament. That's a chance, I think, Robert, then to true up on, are we really investing as we could and should in transport, in schools, in universities, in councils and across the piece?
They're so connected though, energy and transport. The green agenda is about just as much about transport as anything else. So, and you and I, before Robert was a bit late, shock horror everyone, you and I were chatting, and obviously we're both from the northeast. I know you grew up in North Yorkshire but born in Sunderland, and we were moaning about the transport around the north, particularly me because I'm still up there having to deal with it. It could be a lot greener if transport was better. So it does feel
Well,
silly
trains
that-
rather than roads is what you're saying.
Well, yeah, but even if roads were better, that would surely improve things as well. Like, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
More electric cars. I know there's money into that, but it just feels like it shouldn't be about who's leading the department and which personality is stronger, should it? And these are completely intertwined areas.
They are. And I think part of the resolution here might come from the greater devolution and delegation of responsibility to the local level. So a properly devolved transport budget would begin to help, I think.
And that looks like in the Northeast that's going to happen from like 2026. Right. I know it's a bit earlier in Manchester and other parts of the country.
Yeah.
But do you think that'll genuinely make a difference then if these local, combined authorities have their own pots to sort out transport? Because, for example, with trains, there's a huge capacity problem. The whole thing needs an overhaul. It's a Victorian system. If people work on little bits of it, that's not going to solve the overall capacity problem with, a lot of freight travelling on trains and things like that, is it?
Yeah. It'll need to be a combination of, there's bits of national transport infrastructure which will require a national response, a Whitehall response, and then local both bits are a problem. So we have a problem within cities and regions, and we have a problem between cities and regions. And we need to fix both. Of the many things that went wrong with HS2 is that, Rishi switched off HS2 and said, we'll focus our monies on the within city, within region bit, which is reasonable because that's bad as well.
No, but the problem with it is unless you build a new railwork, you're not going to improve the regions until you take away capacity on the lines that, the national lines are sharing with the regional lines. So unless you're going to build an entirely new railway, the regions aren't going to get any better.
We're definitely agreeing on this.
Yeah.
And I hope there's a chance.
I'm going on a rant about trains here. Sorry, it's because I got one this morning and it was late again. But there we are.
Well, there's a huge, up that East Coast main line, that's a huge potential asset, actually.
Yeah.
But not one that's remotely been taken advantage of as much as it might. And I hope there's a chance to relook at that, both the main line and the spurs off it. Because people talk about the north-south divide, and it's definitely there. There's also, though, an east-west divide in the UK now. And that's partly, of course, because nothing runs east-west in the UK very quickly. And that needs thinking about in a much more comprehensive way than has happened so far.
I'm not even sure. This is something we've been banging on about this on this podcast for ages, about the economic benefits of connecting Oxford and Cambridge. And they are doing, they're beginning to do it, but it's a long-term program. And that's certainly, if you're just interested in generating incremental growth, the faster you could do that, the more businesses you will attract based on the knowledge base in those two areas. There is something, though, that I wanted to pick up on again on some of the things you've been saying today. You and I have been discussing the UK's subpar productivity for something like 15 years now.
Yeah. You need to get out more, you two.
Listen, it's definitely the most exciting subject around. And one of the things that you identified, it might be a decade ago now, I can't even remember, but time passes at sort of variable speed. So I'm depending on what we're talking about. So I can't remember when you did this, but some time ago, you identified this problem that we have some very high productivity leading businesses, and then we have a long tail of really low productivity businesses. And it is still part of the British disease, you might say. Yeah. And it's one of the reasons why, we have such low living standards.
Yeah.
One of the things that this government is doing in multiple ways is significantly putting up the costs of businesses. We've got a really big increment to their costs with the imposition of higher national insurance for employers. And, the sums involved are really very significant. So that's one thing. Costs for businesses are going up as a result of these augmentation. Many people think it's a good thing, but augmentation of employees' rights. I think all of us think that's in theory a good thing, but it will have economic consequences for employers whose costs will go up. You've talked about how the cost of capital for the UK may go up for a while because this was, a budget loosening, and interest rates look as though they're going to be a bit higher for longer. You put all this together, and it seems to me two things. A number of things are likely to happen. One of the things that will happen is some employers will try to cut the wages of their staff, which is not great for those people. They'll probably hire fewer people. Something that might be beneficial in the medium, would definitely be beneficial in the medium term for the whole economy and for the employees who still have jobs, is a number of companies will substitute capital for labor. They will invest more in kit that gets more out of their people, which is great if that then translates into higher wages for the people who are employed. But it's not great for those who may be looking for jobs if the jobs aren't there anymore because robots and artificial intelligence are doing those jobs. I suppose what I'm trying to get from you is this feels to me as though this could be a pretty big shock to the British economy, right? And I just wonder, do you think the government is aware of the magnitude of the shock that this could have? Quite a number of businesses may go bust, frankly, as a result of what's happened. And do you think they are, prepared for the transitional, this could lead to a higher skills, higher wage economy. But along the way, it could lead to quite a lot of people losing their jobs. Do you think the government is aware of that risk?
I don't know. It may not be as acutely aware as you've just painted there in primary colours, Robert, I suspect. It is true that it's easy to underestimate the cumulative combined consequences of individual acts, each of which are not difficult to make sense of and rationalise. And it's all the things you mentioned. You didn't mention the minimum wage, by the way, which went up by a hefty amount yesterday too. That's a further cost pressure to business. You didn't mention regulation, but that is quite an overhead for a great many businesses, and not one that's retreating anytime soon. And that is a headwind. There's no question that is a headwind, and that cumulative headwind might be a bit more than we're currently assessing. Layer on top of that the fact that we probably do want to see private businesses investing more to raise their levels of productivity and thereby raising the pay of those that work, because the one follows as night follows day. Might there be some employment cost of that? Almost certainly. The good news is we're starting from a position of low unemployment by any historical metric. We might even be reasonably close to full employment on any reasonable metric. And also leaning the opposite direction is the fact that, these attempts to improve all the things we've mentioned, schooling, skills, transport, energy, are a net positive for businesses. That leans in the other direction. And so too, I would say, is the new government's industrial strategy. The green paper that was published about 10 days ago now. Some monies were set against that strategy yesterday for certain sectors. That, I think, is an important attempt to try and close that gap, Robert, between the business haves and the business have-nots, between the high-flying birds and those that are stuck on ground zero right now. So I'm hopeful that, despite the near-term headwind from all the things that have been mentioned, the medium-term prospects for a better business environment and a more targeted industrial strategy might win through and turn up in higher investment.
But there'll be collateral damage. Is that basically what you're saying?
Any transition, any industrial revolution, and we are going through an industrial revolution, all the things that you both spoke about a lot on this show, and how AI will should transform the business models of almost every sector on the planet, will come at some cost. It always does. We need to manage that cost as best we can. And that's why the skills agenda, by the way, the reskilling agenda, is so important and remains relatively underinvested in, I'd say.
I mean, the thing that worries me is how rapidly it's possible to make a transition from our kind of very unequal economy, massive gap between rich and poor, and an astonishing over-reliance on people on essentially poverty wages, people who can only make ends or can only survive by getting to food banks, despite the fact they're in work, which is I do think it's a scandal for a country as rich as ours that we have those disparities. And so, you would hope that over time, the kind of investment we're seeing would lead to a bit more fairness in the distribution of income. The problem is, will that happen in time to prevent civil unrest or more civil unrest? I mean, we saw civil unrest over the summer. And indeed, will it happen in time to prevent what we're already seeing, the growth of really unpleasant extremism around the place?
Yeah.
And I just worry that in this period of transition, all of that could get really quite a lot worse. If you look at simply the forecasts for living standards based on the measures in this budget, because so much of the benefit only comes through over, sort of, in some cases, 10 years plus, whether it's the OBR itself or the Institute of Fiscal Studies or the Joseph Rowntree Foundation or the Resolution Foundation, they all say on the basis of this budget, living standards will barely rise on average in the course of this parliament over the course of 5 years. That's worrying.
It is. And of course, against the backcloth of living standards having not risen over the previous parliament. That's a long period to be stuck. And actually, arguably that period extends right back to the global financial crisis. Now,
so how do you? So the question is, how do you? If she has so far failed to do anything to improve living standards over the next 5 years, what can she realistically now do, or what should she have done in this budget so that she could both be, because one of the things that, she's constantly saying, I'm investing for the long term, give me praise for that, because chancellors never do that. Well, fine, right? But if you can barely pay your bills, it's a bit of a crisis at the moment. Yeah. So what else should she have been, what else should she do?
One, as you both know, economists, even very good ones, are pessimistic sorts. And when I look at those growth forecasts from all the places you mentioned right now, they look a bit on the gloomy doomy side of neutral. I would say it's easy to kind of smooth pace from the past and say this will be the future. Let's take the OBR. They are rightly skeptical that any one measure will really turn the dial on productivity, and maybe that's right, and maybe it's not. But I think there is scope to eke out some pretty sizable productivity gains in the public sector and in the private sector if we play our cards right. And we've seen other countries do that. We know it's possible.
So what are the interesting? So you say other countries. Which ones impress you?
Well, let's take one. Let's take the Biden administration. Biden invested big in a bunch of things, including green tech, including in chips, including in blue-collar manufacturing jobs. And he has created 15 million jobs over the term of his, not being thanked for his troubles.
I know the Americans don't care about that, it would seem, no?
Well, the cost of living is slightly, but in terms of job creation, in terms of GDP creation, in terms of productivity, they have put us in the shade. And that was the fruits of investing big. So this is possible. This is absolutely possible. We come back to Steph's point of, this was a bold budget. Was it bold enough to turn the dial in the way that happened across there. Not yet would be my verdict.
But I mean, the difference between America and here, quite apart from just decades of them being more ambitious when it comes to almost everything important economically than we are, is Biden, announces the CHIPS Act or the Inflation Reduction Act and the vast, the panoply of measures to invest in precisely the way that you've described, and almost immediately you get shovels in the ground, right? When we do it, it's about 10 years, till you get the shovels in the ground, even when governments make these commitments. Now, this is a government that is committed to reducing some of those, regulatory restrictions that delay, an announcement of money and the building taking place, planning reform and all the rest of it. But are we really confident that, interestingly, I mean, one of the things that the OPR, and I don't think they're wrong about this, said about the front loading of capital spending in the Treasury's plans is they don't believe actually these projects will happen in the next 2 years. They think that pretty much there'll be massive underspending because these projects just won't start, which is pretty demoralizing.
And also coming back to your point on skills, we're not going to be able to just magic up all these people who've got all the skills to do these things as well. Even if you've got the money and you've got the kit, you've not necessarily got the skills there to be able to deliver it all.
These are both obviously good points and right points, and all we can do is set about fixing them. So the blights and blockers on getting spades in the ground are very material, both in a time and at a cost way. We know that. The government is making the right noises about trying to shift that. By the way, things like AI could transform that, by the way. I mean, our planning process could be transformed by AI, much of which is paper pushing between individuals. And the same is true on the skills front. You can have a target for 1.5 million houses built by the end of the Parliament, which is pretty much the same target everyone's had for the last several governments, by the way. You even imply it, to locate the land and the money to make the houses. But if you haven't got the planners, the surveyors, the brickies, the sparkies, and the plumbers, those houses will not be built. And we do not have those skills. We know we don't. But listen, let's form a skills plan to do that much better than we have. I was depressed during the election that so little was said about education and skills. Because if you ask businesses,
it's the key problem.
Biggest
it's like,
blocker
and it
or
has
barrier.
been for years.
And has been for yonks, but it's not been improved by the fact that our workforce has actually shrunk. The more than 9 million people that are now economically inactive, neither seeking work nor training. Now, again, the government's Pathways to Work programme, which is now being piloted with some money attached as of yesterday's budget. This is building off the work that Alan Milburn did up in Barnsley.
Which we talked to him about on this podcast.
All right,
actually.
great. Then you know the plan. I mean, that offers hope of a kind of wraparound support package. But listen, you need business to be part of that as well. They need to want the workers.
Yes, but this is where I have a bit of a beef because, I've, and I know Rob has as well, done a lot of work with businesses and colleges and schools and things. And it's really hard to get the time you need in schools because of the curriculum, because that is what everyone's assessed on is the curriculum, and any kind of collaboration or, input from business is really hard because teachers understandably don't have time to take it on, and it's and it just doesn't work. It's not working.
The current system is not working. I mean, I'd go further than that. The current education system's completely broken. I
agree, by the way, because that's my biggest beef, is that we're not educating people to be able to work. I don't think we are. I think we don't.
No.
We don't make it tangible.
No.
We don't explain all the different jobs out there. We don't make people feel empowered with the skills they have. We just decide whether they're thick or clever based on, esoteric, quite frankly, exams. So it just feels like, there's a big mismatch in what is happening up to the age of 18 and then what's happening in industry and in the rest of the world and what we need them to be at.
I mean, Robert spoke earlier about the tale of two companies. it's mirrored in A Tale of Two Individuals, really, from early years onwards, actually. I mean, the educational pathways bifurcate very early on in life and keep on widening on a lifelong basis. That's leading to extraordinary numbers of people, young people, kids, effectively being excluded from our educational system completely. I mean, if you're a free school meal eligible child, you're almost as likely to be excluded as included.
That's shocking.
Now, right? And then you're out. You're pretty much out for life then. You're on the educational low road. It's a hell of a job to get back onto the high road from there. We do need a root and branch rethink, not just of what we teach, the curriculum. That's part of the problem. But the larger problem for me is how we go about teaching and learning that's more practical, more team-based, more experiential rather than examination-based, is just what we need. And I hope the new government can lean into that quite different agenda right from early years, right through into the world of work.
The thing that I worry about is, in a sense, how conventional they are in their conventional and lacking in courage. I mean, this may seem...
Who's the they for this?
Sorry?
Who is the they for this purpose?
The government.
Right.
And you may think this is sort of a non sequitur, but I think it is directly relevant, because in order to reform education in the way that's necessary,
right,
to create, or to help young people to acquire the creativity, the flexibility, the resilience, the broader knowledge base that will allow them to thrive in these very challenging times, you've got to challenge the very powerful lobby that says, you got to learn, you got to memorize a whole bunch of facts and then spew them out in an exam, and that is the gold standard, right? And there's an enormous, lobby in this country that says you mess around with essentially robotic learning and somehow you are destroying the essence of British education. And that, for me, that's a cancer, right? That's one of the reasons why we don't have.
Yeah, I agree.
By the way, we're all parents.
Yeah.
We are part of the lobby,
yeah.
right? There's no bigger blocker on schools and education reform than parents. So we are among the lobby. We are part of the problem.
The media and politics both, I think, are part of the problem, though, in this, like the bigger part of the problem, because, for example, we don't celebrate vocational training results in the way we celebrate A-level results day or GCSE results day, or
so.
You don't see a picture of twins on the front of the Telegraph getting their BTEC results, do you? It's always A-level results or whatever. So it is but it's because
But I even think among the sort of academic high flyers, it's still too narrow what they learn. So it's not just, the abandoned kids from low-income families. It's everybody, I think, is not learning in the creative way that we would like. And I mean, so just very briefly, because I didn't quite finish, I was saying I was about to do a non sequitur. For me, it's not quite the most depressing thing in the budget, but I was genuinely depressed that they did not put fuel up by more than the rate of inflation. They did not impose the so-called fuel escalator.
The fuel lobby group,
which is successive chancellors since 2011. It is basically written into law here that petrol is supposed to go up by more than the rate of inflation. No chancellor has done that since 2010 because they are terrified of the Sun newspaper and the motorist lobby, right? And if you're not going to do the right thing in terms of putting up duty on a fuel that is bad for the planet, right? If you're not going to do it in the first year of a parliament where you have just the biggest majority anybody could conceive of, you're never going to do it. So at that point, I just thought these people haven't got a backbone. It's extraordinary.
It does show you how powerful, though, the lobby groups are on that front. Like, you were talking about personalities in the cabinet. It shows you that makes some huge difference too.
There are these specific policy measures in yesterday's budget. For me, the bigger question mark from yesterday's budget was very little, if anything, was said about reform of the systems we're talking about.
Yeah.
Very little was said about reform of our education system, reform even of our healthcare
social
system
care
and more
as well.
and more besides. And I don't think that means it's written off. I think the aspiration is actually absolutely to do that.
But they haven't got a plan. It's early days.
It's early days for a plan. You'd
Say
say,
is it early days though? If you've been in opposition forever, surely what you're doing is planning.
yes and no. I mean, there's very little in opposition.
But they knew they were going to win. They've had plenty. I don't buy into this. Businesses in the middle of a pandemic had to suddenly turn their entire systems on their head in days. We all suddenly had to work differently and we all managed it.
Yeah.
Why are politicians so slow?
Well, when it comes to mega reforms of our education system, of our healthcare system, of our transport system, that's a pretty involved thing.
Yeah.
Especially when we're talking about reform of the scale that we are talking about now, with ministers, and this is not their fault, who largely have not run anything previously, much less overseen, architected and delivered reform. So, it's 3 months in. I think a bigger moment to address these questions will be the spending review in the spring of next year. That's the point where the rubber hits the road in terms of, is there going to be really lasting, comprehensive, root and branch reform of these things that we all agree are teetering, fragile, in some cases, I would say, broken. I mean, on this, let's take the education model, right? Why can't we move to a model in which degree apprenticeships are the rule rather than the exception?
On-the-job training while you're getting your qualification.
Exactly. Works for the individual. Pathway into work is much more straightforward. Works for the firm.
Yeah.
A ready-made employee.
So I just on that, just to jump in, obviously the criticism, whenever I have this rant, the criticism I sometimes get levied at me is, well, hang on, what about the creatives or, people who there isn't necessarily a job? My argument back is, wouldn't it be great if you could also help the creatives with how they could make money out of being creative too? So, it might not be on the job training as such, but maybe it's the business lessons that go along with, if you want to be an artist, how can you make money from your art as well as the joy of your art? And I think that's the other element to this. It's not just always going to necessarily into a business or an organisation to work for them. It's how you can empower yourself through your education to do whatever you love and make money from it in order to live.
Well, I mean, in some ways, the creative industries is the best example possible of how this model could work. I mean, right now, because more than a quarter of the workforce is freelance, they don't have access to a ready-made training. I mean, the apprentice levy doesn't work for them.
Yeah, true.
We need to rethink and repurpose that for this more flexible, itinerant workforce in a way that gives them a job and training offering in partnership, in parallel, in a way that largely isn't the case right now. So these are the debates we're not having.
So another debate I don't think we're really having in an honest way is around demographics. And, I don't want to sound... The problem is, whenever the three of us have a conversation, we create the impression, that there's just no hope. It's all too gloomy, and I don't think that. But I do think that if there is going to be hope, you need leadership that acknowledges some of the big structural problems we've got. One of them is, an aging population, fewer people of working age supporting people who can no longer work, a political backdrop where it's looks politically impossible to correct that through immigration, which was a traditional route for correcting some of the problems of relative decline of numbers of workers, and a birth rate that is falling. So on that basis, you would argue that at a time when the health service as a share of our national income is bigger than it's ever been, and we are getting really lousy outcomes from all of that, the imperative has to be really radical reform, because chucking money at the problem is simply taking us down a road where we cannot remotely afford, whether it's the health service or any public service.
Right.
And
Wes Streeton said that.
But do you think, the penny has dropped to the extent that it should do? Quite a lot of money was announced to go into the health service for day-to-day spending. We all have a lot of sympathy for that, given how appalling the service is. But you can't keep putting those sums of money in forever. And not get, with these, if you're going to continue to get these terrible outcomes. We've got the worst cancer survival rates of any wealthy country at the moment.
Right. Well, I mean, on the narrow health question, I mean, Wes has sketched the contours of reform he wants to deliver on, and they all seem extremely sensible, including a big shift towards digital, including a big shift towards preventative, including a big shift towards local. All those things make sense. The key will be the delivery. Funnily enough, on the areas of reform, the one about which I'm most optimistic happens to be health, in part because of Wes, and in part because, he has in Alan Milburn someone who understands the system to navigate through the vested interests. But that plainly would not be enough by itself to solve the demographic issue. I won't call it a problem, because it ought to be a good thing that we're living longer lives, actually. But that will require shifts beyond health. And among the most important is that we find a way of enabling people to stay on the workforce much longer than is the case right now. And the rates of attrition from the workforce after the age of 50 are startling, actually, for a variety of reasons, some health-related, some lifestyle-related, but also to the fact that, businesses tend not to hire people over the age of 50. There's implicit, in some cases explicit, ageism in the workforce. That's a huge loss, because we know those people are often, almost by definition, the most experienced and expert in their field. So for me, this is a place where business, working with government, does need to rethink the contract it has with their employees in a way that enables them to stay on. Maybe it's a question of more flexibility, more occupational health, more skilling and reskilling of the workforce to enable them to feel comfy about both reflowing and being retained in the workforce to help beat back the very real demographic forces that Robert mentioned.
Before we let you go, obviously you spent, 32 years at the Bank of England. Obviously, a lot of people are going to be thinking, what is this budget going to mean for the future of inflation and interest rates? Is it going to impact, when the Bank of England, when the MPC cut interest rates? Yeah. Do you think it will?
I think there's a chance it might. I mean, the OBR said yesterday they thought it might because it's a significant fiscal stimulus for next year in particular. Growth approaching a 2 number, imagine. And therefore, that might slow down a bit the path south of bank rate that was otherwise being expected. I hope not too much, because, as I said to Robert previously, if anything, the bank has been a bit slow in getting started with its cutting. There's been an acknowledgement of that, actually, over the past couple of months, that largely it's job done on the inflation front. The OBR's projections suggest inflation might pick up a little bit next year.
I mean, it says that the budget will add a 0.5 percentage point to the rate of inflation, and the implication of that is, interest rates will be a bit higher for longer. But would you suggest to your former MPC Monetary Policy Committee colleagues that they just shrug that off and cut again now?
I absolutely would. On their primary mandate, again, we're there or thereabouts in terms of the 2% inflation target. And let's be clear, this is hardly an economy that's roaring ahead. It's staggering sideways very largely. And I think it needs that lower cost of borrowing. That's one of the things that ought to provide a degree of giddy up to the business sector, a bit of support for the business sector, which kind of sorely needs that. And just one aspect of that, actually, it is the case that a lot of businesses now are encumbered with a heavy burden of debt, partly by dint of COVID.
And the era of cheap debt.
And the era of cheap debt, my fault, at least in part that. And I do think we need to look at that and ask whether there's a way of alleviating that burden in a way that might put a bit of a spring in their step.
What do you mean by that?
I think back to the early 80s and to the early 90s recession. And back then there was steps taken actually by my former employers, the Bank of England, to sit round the table between debtor and creditors and seek a voluntary mediated solution to oppressive debt problems, to write down that debt or to reprofile that debt in a way that sets businesses free to begin investing in themselves and therefore growing. And I think there's a case for at least thinking about whether something similar. Right now, all you can do as a business and sit and wait for the insolvency practitioners to turn up. That suits no one, neither debtor nor creditor. Something pre-insolvency, something voluntary, that agrees that the best path for both debtor and creditors is a restructuring of debt that lightens their load, enables them to invest in themselves and to get themselves going and growing.
Or pay all these wage bills that have just gone up.
Or pay the extra wage bills, alleviate the extra cost in the pipeline, might be among the things we might contemplate.
I mean, we haven't got much time, but I am now going to say something slightly harsh here, which is that one of the problems with, the long period of near zero interest rates, which you now personally taking responsibility for.
Not just me, Robert.
I don't think it is just you, actually. I was going to say I think you're being a bit harsh on yourself. But anyway, one of the consequences of the long period of near zero interest rates, and indeed social pressure on banks not to pull the rug, is there are quite a lot of companies out there that arguably have no right to exist. That they're run by incompetent people, and they just kept they're paying basically penury to their staff, and it would be rather better if some of these businesses were put out of their misery and the capital reallocated to businesses with decent prospects to grow and pay proper wages. So there's a limit, frankly, to how much you want to put in place mechanisms to keep afloat businesses that, frankly, should be allowed to, one doesn't want to be too Darwinian about it, but a bit of Darwinian economics a bit of Darwinian economics would be no bad thing, it seems to me.
Listen, this economy needs a greater degree of dynamism in its business sector, which actually means a bit more failure, not a bit less. A bit more entry and exit, actually, both ends of the pipeline. And indeed, in its jobs market, people are about 50% less likely to move jobs than they were 20 years ago.
Is that true?
Yeah.
Because in the old days, we all thought the problem was people had jobs, but genuinely over the last 20 years, job mobility has decreased.
Decreased significantly.
That's really worrying. I wasn't aware of that.
So
is that in a particular age bracket though? That can't be.
No, it's pretty
millennials.
It's pretty broadly based.
And you don't get the paternalism from your employer anymore, so you're stuck in a low wage job which doesn't give you a decent pension or this is really I hadn't realized, because I thought at least that during the sort of Thatcherite Blair era we went to a period of at least a bit more job mobility, but that's all gone again, has it?
It's back to this insecurity problem we started with, right? This risk aversion. Far less likely to set a business up. It's less likely the rug will be pulled on a business. It's less likely that you move job. Now, we know all of those things are good overall. They come with costs. Overall, they are good, though, for productivity. The way you get a pay rise is by moving job. Something I know to my cost, having only moved job once in my life. We do need a bit more of that. What we don't need is uncontrolled defaults and insolvencies in the business sector. That we don't need.
No, sure. There's a what you need is dynamism as opposed to mega shocks.
That's right.
We definitely haven't got enough dynamism, certainly when it comes to business creation in this country. And obviously I was aware of the mobility problem when it comes to people not leaving their communities terribly often. But I hadn't realised that even within communities, people don't move jobs terribly often. That is genuinely
less than in the past.
That's genuinely worrying.
I was just going to say, and on that, we should probably wrap up at some
Sadly,
point and leave.
But we want to come back to all of this
job.
because this issue about how you. But then we should come back to it because this issue about how you create, both more business formation and the right kind of job mobility is really important.
Well, there's loads. And there's loads we haven't even asked you. I feel like there was at least another...
As always.
2 hours.
Well, I mean,
come back.
And the government has got other chances to come back. We have seen a big shift. The day after the election, Rachel pretty much did say, I'm not going to be reckless. I'm going to be very cautious. And that was a bold budget we had yesterday. We're arguing about, was it bold enough? And I think there's further to go. But already there's been quite a big shift. And I think there's scope for further boldness, the need for further boldness to fire up the economy.
Quick question then, quick answer that means as well.
Got it.
When can we say whether this has been good or not? Well, at which point are we going to be able to say she's on the right track? Because, you mentioned the spending review. We kind of push the... What's the measure? When are we going to say, yeah, that was good?
I think the spending review is a more important moment than yesterday's budget.
Right. So spring is going to tell us what?
It's going to tell us the degree of boldness with which this government will go about the root and branch or not reform of all the things we've been discussing today. It's the point at which we'll know what the spending envelope for departments will be in the remainder of this Parliament. On current trajectories, we'll be into mini austerity by the end of this Parliament. One of the perversities of the budget yesterday was that all the spending is front-loaded.
Yeah.
In a completely unrealistic way. But we haven't really discussed that. We probably haven't got time for that now. But I mean, one of the things you say that the spending review is going to be more important, and I think in many ways you're right, because at that point at least we should have some idea of how imaginative they're being in terms of reforming public services, trying to get productivity up in public services. But nobody believes that the 1.3% allocated for the rest of the Parliament in terms of day-to-day spending increases is remotely realistic. So, but she's also said she's not going to have another budget until next autumn. So I don't know. It's there are still some quite big unanswered questions about should we say the competence of the government. We'll see.
And no one's ever going to believe us again when we say we're ending a podcast and then carry on for another 20 minutes.
But I think we have got to wrap. We have got to wrap now with a promise that we'll get Andy back in.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much, Andy. That's it from us on The Rest is Money. Bye bye.
Goodbye.
And bye from me as well. Thanks, Steph and Robert.